Today's section is about perpendicular lines. This is section 2-5 in your textbook. The essential question for this section is, what are perpendicular lines and what are the theorems relating to them? So, what exactly are perpendicular lines? Perpendicular lines are simply two lines that intersect to form right angles, or 90-degree angles if you prefer. Now, as you know, if you have two lines that intersect, they are going to form four angles. If we can determine that any one of those four angles is 90 degrees, then by definition we know that the two lines are perpendicular. So now we can look at the definition in two ways. For example, if we know that two lines are perpendicular, then we know that they form right angles by definition. Similarly, if two lines form right angles, then by definition they are perpendicular. So these can be used in all future proofs. So now let's look at three theorems that relate specifically to perpendicular lines. Now the first of these theorems is Theorem 2-4, and it states, if two lines are perpendicular, then they form congruent adjacent angles. Now again, if you think about this, think of two perpendicular lines, they do form a right angle, and they do form adjacent right angles. The next theorem is Theorem 2-5, and you might think of this as simply being the converse of Theorem 2-4, because Theorem 2-5 states, if two lines form congruent adjacent angles, then the lines are perpendicular. Now the last of these theorems is Theorem 2-6. And this theorem says, if the exterior sides of two adjacent acute angles are perpendicular, then the angles are complementary. I would like to conclude this section with two additional theorems that don't relate to perpendicular lines, but complete this chapter. The first of these theorems is Theorem 2-7. This theorem states that if two angles are supplements of congruent angles, or the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. So in order to explain this theorem, let's consider the following. We've got angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. Angle 3 and angle 4 are supplementary. So here you have two angles, angles 1 and angle 3, that are supplements of congruent angles, because angle 2 and angle 4 are congruent. So therefore, because of this theorem, we know that angle 1 must be congruent to angle 3. Now Theorem 2-8 is pretty much the same as Theorem 2-7. The only difference is now we're talking about complementary angles. But the idea is basically the same. So Theorem 2-8 states, if two angles are complements of congruent angles or of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. Now this pretty much concludes Chapter 2. We will be having a test on this in a few days.